Hello guys, and welcome to today's webinar. We hope everyone is keeping well. Today we're delighted and honoured to have Alexander Stubb and Samantha Simmonds. Alexander Stubb is the former Prime Minister, Finance Minister and Foreign Minister of Finland, currently Professor and Director at the European University Institute in Florence. Samantha has been a journalist and broadcaster for more than 20 years. She's currently presenting on BBC World News, where she covers international events. We're very happy to have them with us today. And with that, I will pass over to Samantha and Alexander.
Hello, thank you. Very good morning to everybody. Alexander, wonderful to have you with us, and a warm welcome to everyone joining us for this webinar. It's a beautiful day here in London. I'm in lockdown in North London with my family, my 3 kids and my husband. Alexander, tell us about you and your circumstances. How's lockdown going there?
Yeah, well, wonderful weather here in southern Finland, in Helsinki as well. And we have sort of semi-lockdown. Kids are 18 and 16. They're doing home schooling by themselves. And then my wife is working here at home as well. So it's good family time. And I must admit, I'm getting a little bit used to this. It's quite comfortable, huh?
Yeah, that's because you don't have to homeschool your kids like I have to do mine. Mine are very young, so it's a challenge, I can tell you.
It's true, it's true. Teenagers are much easier than toddlers.
So let's talk about why we're all here. COVID-19, we're in the middle of a global pandemic. We're going to discuss the true cost of this pandemic. Let's first of all start talking about the financial implications. We're seeing huge government borrowing all over the world, with certainly here in the UK, the government trying to support people and businesses. They're talking about the short term. They said whatever the cost is, it will be worth it. But what will the cost be? How long term are governments looking now? Are they just dealing with the short term? Are they thinking about the long term implications?
Yeah, 2 answers on that. The first one is that, I think that we have a tendency to over-rationalize the past, to over-dramatize the present, and to underestimate the future. And that's very much a sentiment I have about the current ongoing debate as well. Point number 2, I remember when I was foreign minister in 2008, my first budget negotiations with the Finnish government in August. And we had the best economists in Finland, from the Bank of Finland, from the finance ministry and other institutions. And they said, no problem. 2009, we're looking at growth rates between 3.5% and 4.5%. We're driven by the Nokia economy. Everything is going to be fine. Of course, 3 weeks later, Lehman Brothers and our economy contracted 10% subsequently. So to give you a short answer, no one really knows. This is uncharted territory. We're getting as Keynesian as we can get. And I think all governments right now are pumping in money into the economy as we speak.
Yeah, which countries do you think are going to come out of this better or worse off financially? Or again, is it just too soon to say?
Yeah, it's difficult to say. I mean, the way in which I want to look at it is there are 2 indicators that in this sort of war of words or even propaganda. One is the death toll and the infection toll. And the second one is, when will the economy bounce back? And I actually think that there's 3 regions that are fighting for these honors. One is China, one is the United States, and the third one is Europe, broadly speaking, especially the European Union. And of course, if you look at the situation right now, you could make an argument, well, China is trying to bounce back, but are they going to? The US hasn't hit rock bottom yet. It has had very substantial consequences, both in terms of death toll and economy. And Europe is probably somewhere in between. So I don't, I think it's going to take 2 to 3 years before we can make a final assessment. I do say, however, one thing, and that is that I think the countries and regions that come out of this best are the ones who take care of the welfare of their citizens during this crisis. And therefore, I would argue that probably strong welfare states are the best ones, not in terms of economic growth, but in terms of social rest.
Are we heading for a global depression, though, inevitably?
Yeah, I certainly think so. I mean, I've been looking at the figures coming from the IMF. I've been looking at figures coming from central banks. I think it's kind of a non-brainer to say that we're going to see contracting economies. First, we'll talk about a recession, then we'll talk about a depression. The question is how fast we'll be able to bounce back. Usually in these types of situations,
I lost you there. I'm not sure if everybody else did. You froze
And
my end.
now I hope I'm back. I
You're
hope I'm
back.
back. And I
Go
was
on.
just
You
about
were halfway through this answer. You said usually in this type of situation.
Usually in this type of situation, I'd like to say that Finnish 4G and internet works really well, but clearly not. No, I was going to say that some parts of the economy, services industry, whether travel, for instance, is going to be very hard hit. That's clear. But then if you look at some of the tech giants right now and the innovations coming up, you look at retail from the sort of mailing side on Amazon, etc. So it's going to be very asymmetrical, the hit to the economy, and this usually leads to innovation.
Yeah, we'll talk a bit more about that a little later. I just want to talk more about the financial implications, because people are obviously worried about their immediate situations, many people being furloughed all around the world, private business owners going bust with governments in some countries trying to support them. But who is going to end up paying for this pandemic? Is it going to be our generation? Is it going to be our children? Is it something that's going to go on for many decades?
Well, I was intimately involved with the financial crisis that started in 2008, which then became a euro crisis later on. And one of the key arguments that we always used with the austerity policies that came from Finland was that we cannot take this debt over to the next generations. We have to be responsible. I guess the same argument goes for climate as well. I do think, as I said earlier, this is going to be a Keynesian crisis. You are going to see rules and regulations linked to fiscal policies in nation states around the world being stretched to the limit. It is quite clear that central banks around the world, including the European Central Bank, will have to be intimately involved to keep the financial markets afloat. So I guess I could say that at the end of the day, of course, the next generations will ultimately have to pay the debt back. But in what form, we simply don't know at this stage yet. It is uncharted territory.
Now that we're seeing such massive state intervention, though, to try to keep economies afloat and people's heads above water, there's a phrase here in the UK that politicians have bandied around about there being no magic money tree. I don't know if you've heard that. Well, it seems there is a magic money tree. And now that people know that and know that the taps can be turned on in times of extremists like this, do you think actually economies, countries will ever be the same again?
Well, we have to look at the short term and long term. In the short term, I think everyone is doing everything in their power to try to solve this situation, whether you have an election coming or not, whether you come from an authoritarian state or not. And that means that you use a broad range of instruments. You use your central bank, as the European Central Bank has been doing here in the European Union. You pump government money into saving small and medium-sized businesses. You use multilateral institutions such as the European Investment Bank to get money afloat. You come up with big packages from different types of entities. I do think that we will all hit harsh reality at some stage. Whether that happens, this summer, next fall, or next year, will this change the economy? Yes, I think there is an eternal tension between state and market. And if you look at the post-Cold War era, post-1989, the collapse of communism, this was the era of market. But the state started to make a comeback, I would argue, in 2008 with the financial crisis. And now we're going to see the pendulum swing towards state again, and they will become much more important than what they have been in the past. So yeah, there will be changes, but probably not revolution.
Well, let's talk about the national and international implications and fallout from all of this. All countries looking to one another to see how each other's tackling this, both on a financial and a medical front. From your analysis, which countries do you think are leading the way on both sides?
Oh, I'm just a humble political scientist and a former prime minister. I wouldn't dare to give you the exact answer. Up here in the north, in Scandinavia, we have countries that are taking a very different approach. So we have Finland, which has gone into a semi-lockdown. You have Denmark, which went into quite a strong lockdown, as did Norway. But then Sweden has gone on pretty much as is. They have believed in this sort of communal immunity, if you will. So if you look at the death figures right now, it's clear, Sweden is 10 times higher, even more than what we are here in Finland or in Denmark or in Norway. But, we simply don't know enough about the virus yet, whether that's the right way to go about it or not. Economically, it's going to be very difficult to say who is going to, come out the best. The interesting thing here is that the virus hits symmetrically. It's basically knows no borders. It's global. It goes everywhere. But the consequences of it are asymmetrical for the economy. As I said earlier, I think the ones that have fairly strong welfare states, they will survive. But the Scandinavian countries which have strong welfare states, they're also very open economies. And that means that if world trade goes down, they're in trouble. So I'm not going to announce a winner yet at this stage. Resilience is very important, these kinds of things. You have to try to avoid social unrest, and you have to try to avoid making it too political. This is why I'm quite worried. As a strong pro-American, I'm a little bit worried about what's going on in the US at the moment.
Well, interestingly, Angela Merkel, I don't know if you've seen, has said in the past few hours that coronavirus, she says, is actually a challenge to democracy. What do you think she means by that? And do you think she's right?
Yeah, I think she's right. And I don't say this only because she's a good friend and we're still in touch. I think what she means here is that you have some democratic leaders with authoritarian tendencies who are ready to give up the principles and values, which are the foundation and the basis, especially of the European Union. So liberal democracy, human rights, rule of law, fundamental rights, protecting minorities, and also free press. And I think she's pointing the finger, albeit a little bit subtly, towards Viktor Orban in Hungary, perhaps Kaczynski in Poland, and then the rhetoric coming out from people like Salvini in Italy. And I do think that if on one hand this is a balance between state and market, this is also a balance between freedom and control, between liberalism and surveillance. And interestingly enough, there are people in Europe, sensible liberal Democrats who are saying that, well, I'm actually quite okay with this surveillance if it makes me more secure and protects me from the virus. So I think she is right that this is a challenge to democracy.
Do you think it's amazing how quickly, though, we've all adjusted to this control that we're now having from the state? On the whole, certainly in this country, people are obeying the orders and they are sticking to the restrictions. And I'm quite surprised, actually, how we've all subtly but easily just adjusted to this new normal.
Yeah, I think this will be a new normal during the crisis, but once the crisis unravels and we settle things down, it's going to change again. I won't make a marketing exercise here, but I am writing a book right now, which is called Digital Democracy or Digital Dictatorship, the struggle for power between China, the US, and Europe. And of course, this deals a lot with the issue of privacy, surveillance, and control. So in China, and I am simplifying, of course, you already have social media apps which basically tell everything about you. And with algorithms and the use of data, some of the apps know more about you than you know about yourself. And people are essentially quite cool about it. This was not the case before in the United States, nor in Europe either. But now, as I said earlier, we're sort of getting used to the idea of allowing our security to be protected through more surveillance. But when we're starting to push, facial recognition and the gathering of data, we are going to have big ethical and moral debates about this. And I do think that this will be one of the fascinating outcomes of this crisis. How far do we take this?
Well, if there was a time to write a book like that, it's certainly now. And you're going to have some fascinating case studies from different countries. I just want to remind our audience that there is an opportunity to put their questions to you at the end of our chat. So please put your questions on the Q&A little box at the bottom of the Zoom kind of page. And I will try and put some of those to you, Alexander, in a couple of minutes. I want to talk to you about the EU and how they're handling it. As somebody, a politician who's intimately involved with the European Union, there's going to be a council meeting today. If you were still Finnish Prime Minister, how would you preparing? How do they try and manage this pandemic as an EU state? Because obviously the UK is not involved anymore.
Yeah, well, I mean, two answers on this. I sort of joke around sometimes and I say that, what's the best working title in the world? Well, it's former prime minister, because you basically don't have to take the crap anymore, but everyone knows that you've done it. Now, if I were in this telemeeting actually at 3 o'clock, I'd be probably preparing, of course, with my civil servants to see, you know, what is the line that we're going to take. And I would be making some phone calls, sending some WhatsApp messages and text messages to my colleagues and asking, you know, what line are you going to take? What are you going to push for? Can I support you on that? So it's kind of normal meeting preparation. Of course, you know, these Teams or Zoom type of meetings, they are very different. You know, we all know it from now. I mean, I used to say that the European Council was a wonderful big psychotherapy session, you know, because you were there only with the prime ministers and presidents and no one else, and you'd sort of tap each other on the shoulder and say, I know what you're going through at home, isn't it awful? Now you can't kind of do that with all the civil servants looking at the screen and most probably a whole bunch of surveillance going on. So it's not that intimate. And I don't expect, you know, big things from the European Council today. And quite often what happens is it's high expectation and low outcome, but don't expect much from today. You'll get some language on, you know, Corona funds and solidarity and this kind of stuff, but that language is going to come only from the President of the European Council, Charles Michel. There's not going to be a joint communique.
So let's talk about any potential positives to come out of this pandemic. Certainly on the technological front, people say that it is going to drive change. I mean, we're seeing certainly on the medical side of things, people working together all over the world to come up with a vaccine as quickly as possible. What do you think the potential positives are?
Well, the first thing to observe is that, you know, once we're starting to move towards a world where a lot of the mundane tasks that we used to do are basically done by algorithms and robots, artificial intelligence, it does alleviate space and time for other things. And I think the most important thing that we as human beings at that stage can portray is empathy. You know, the capacity for us to show warmth, you know, love and caring and sharing with fellow human beings. And in many ways, globally, that's exactly what we're doing right now. Whether it's, you know, through social media or video clips or, you know, applauding on balconies to healthcare workers or organizing concerts. I mean, there's this sort of element of warmth in this, which at least for me, I find it very, very positive. The other thing that we'll learn is new ways of working. I know, Samantha, you have toddlers there, so you know, it's a bit tougher for you. And I know that a lot of people around the world are in similar type of situations. But listen, I fly about 120 days a year all over the world, many times giving speeches with London Speakers Bureau, and thanks for that. But you know, this has given a completely new opportunity to do stuff. So yesterday I gave a lecture at Harvard Law School, right? I didn't have to fly to Boston. You know, today I have another one coming in London. I've done a couple to Asia. So, you know, it is changing for many of us. And it's for the first time that we're really, really using these instruments. I'm also looking at my wife, who works for the second largest elevator maker that happens to be Finnish. I won't mention it in fear of product placement. But, you know, I look at the efficiency of their teams working all around the world, and it's fascinating to see. So I do think this is going to change our pattern in the future. You know, no point to, you know, fly all over the place for meetings when we can do it like this.
Do you think that that will have a long-term shift, that people will recognize that there is no need to be there in person? Because you were talking about how the EU Council meeting, it will be very different because it will be via Zoom or another, you know, similar app. But do you think actually the human interchange still really needs to be there for a lot of these type of things, for a lot of these meetings? Or actually it doesn't really matter, and because this is the new normal for now, it may become the new normal, well, for the future, that people will be able to work from home more? And certainly actually when I think about, you know, a lot of my friends who struggle with flexi time, that maybe businesses may be more adaptable now and more open to that now that they've seen that it can work.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I should have a bit of a disclaimer here. Of course, I'm a Finn, and you know, we Finns are very shy. And the difference between an extrovert and introvert Finn is that the extrovert, when he speaks to you, looks at your feet. Introvert, you know, looks at his own. So, you know, so I do understand that other people want to be a little bit more lovey-dovey and touchy. No, I do think at the end of the day, the human touch will be key, and we're not going to stop. speaking events. We're not going to stop meetings, but there will be a little bit of rationalization about it, because we're not still at the Star Wars stage of beaming people, in front of an audience. But we'll start using this technology. It'll become more virtual. It'll become more 3D. Now, of course, all of us are working with Teams and Zoom and Skype and the rest of it. But there will be a moment when we'll have these rooms, and they already are. I've seen them, virtual meeting rooms where you really feel that you're physically present. So I think we'll tone down a little bit the physical meetings, and this will be part of the future. And I think a fascinating part as well. I mean, I was listening to the beginning of this, and people tapping in from Cape Town, from Oman, from London, from all around the world. And I think that's a really exciting perspective.
Now, what impact is all of this going to have on climate change? Because we're all obviously applauding the fact that our streets are free from pollution, the skies are free from pollution with no planes practically flying all over the world. Is this again going to be short term? Is this going to have a long term impact? Because meanwhile, power stations are still, pumping out electricity. They have to. Do you think this is just a blip, or will we see again a shift in the way that we approach the issue of climate change?
I think it's going to have both short-term and long-term implications, and they're linked to our patterns of behavior and then to innovation, especially in technology. Just short-term, to give you an idea, it's 80 kilometers from Helsinki to Tallinn, approximately. So when you are in the outer archipelago of Helsinki, you don't usually see to Tallinn. Now, after a 2-month lockdown, you can see evening lights coming from Tallinn. And, that's phenomenal. And that is only because there is less pollution in the air, and less flights, less boats, less factories, and the rest of it. And that's great. And of course, all of us are changing our patterns as well. I've driven the car a few times during the lockdown, but not too much really. So that is going to change. Now, second and long term, here's where we have to be very careful. I think the key is to use this moment and opportunity for two things. Number one is to push the bucket on clean tech or clean technology. Try to work on the types of innovations that provide a good fighting block against climate change. I mean, Bill Gates talks a lot about this. It's not anymore so much about restrictions. It's about coming up with the technological solutions on how we get out of this. So, and here I think actually some Europeans might have a competitive advantage, not because of regulation, but the fact that there is environmental knowledge and technological knowledge. And I'd like to see a lot of work coming from China on this as well, and also from the United States. The second lesson that we must draw is because, the next crisis that we have, it might be another pandemic, that's fine, but it is going to be a climate crisis. And if we don't draw the lessons from that, then I think we'll be in trouble. So when sea levels start to rise, when temperatures go up, when new migratory movements start happening, I do admit right now we have anti-migration, people don't move, but there will be a day. So we need to draw lessons. And my argument is very much a sort of Yuval Noah Harari argument, is that we need global solutions for these global problems, and that's what we need to work on.
Well, you mentioned that phrase climate crisis. It was one that we were hearing increasingly towards the end of last year. Greta Thunberg really pushing the agenda. And it seemed like for the first time, governments around the world were waking up, even though the climate conference in Spain last year didn't lead to any positive conclusions. There was a real emphasis on the climate crisis summit that was going to happen in Scotland here later on this year. That's now been pushed back till next year. Are you concerned that it's because we're all dealing with this immediate issue of this pandemic that actually the climate crisis has been kind of pushed not just out of the headlines, but out of people's minds and, off the agenda? People are just trying to deal with the immediate issue and not long term.
I'm not concerned. I actually think it's a very natural reaction. You want to deal with the crisis at hand. And this crisis is about days, weeks, months, perhaps a year, depending on when we solve it. And I think a lot and most of the brightest minds, and also in terms of government, has to be focused on that at the moment. I think, this is all about awareness. We'll understand what this type of pandemic crisis is now. And once this starts to tone down, I think a lot of minds will start shifting towards the climate crisis, perhaps drawing some lessons from the ongoing pandemic, and then drawing solutions from there. And I also think that, you know, a lot of people will have seen throughout this crisis what a clean environment and clean air actually means, and that will then be sort of spilled over into the negotiations. I still say that the climate crisis is not going to be solved through public means, through pure public regulations or goals. That is excellent for pushing business, but we need technological invention. We need the private sector to be on board on this. Otherwise, we won't solve it. It won't be solved with public money. We're going to have to blend in private money. It won't be solved with public regulation. We're going to have technological innovation. And we're all in this boat together.
We certainly are. We've talked a lot about all the wider implications. What about the personal ones? We've talked about where you are, where I am in lockdown with trying to homeschool my 3 kids, which is just, a whole other ball game. I'd much rather be in the newsroom, and I still have to go to work. There are people like me who still have to go into their office, but not all that many. In the meantime, you talk a lot about mind, body, and happiness, Alexander. Where do we find any of that in the current situation when we are restricted? Certainly here, we're supposed to only go out for 1 hour a day. You know, we're confined to, for most of us, a small space. If you're lucky, you know, I feel very lucky that I've got a garden. Lots of people don't. But how do we try and find any kind of calm and inner peace at the moment?
Well, I guess 2 observations on this. The first one is to say that this does hit us asymmetrically. You know, there are really people who are working, 24/7 to try to help people, to try to solve the crisis, and they're in the middle of it. You know, they're sort of in the situation room, if you will. And then there are people who are being hit very hard economically, losing jobs, companies going bankrupt. So you can't kind of compare. But say if you were a bog standard academic like myself now, with so-called tenure or at least a contract, it does change, and it gives you an opportunity perhaps to focus a little bit more on the personal side. I myself, found myself, because I was for 8 years in government, 12 years in politics. I mean, you are in this cycle, you never seem to get out. Now suddenly I've been grounded, I'm hanging out here with the family, having kind of the best personal time of my life. So it's quite easy to focus on mind and body. But there are a couple of things. I mean, if you have that luxury at the moment, I mean, I have one philosophy which is simple on the physical side. You know, 1 hour of exercise gives you 2 more hours of energy for every day. And there are thousands of ways of doing this, and you just sort of create your own routines. Of course, it's lovely if you can go out. I mean, I can turn the camera around and show you our garden, which is quite sunny and nice at the moment, but I know that not everyone has that. Then I think routines are very important. You know, you sort of, especially if you're at home, you know, you need to have almost a calendar, okay? You know, I get up at that time, I have that meeting, then I do homeschooling at that time, I read a book at that time, because otherwise the days just blend into each other. But I do think that, you know, for a happy and fulfilling life, if you will, you need 2 things. One is body, and the other one is mind, and both of them need training and nutrition and energy.
Yeah, talking of timetables, when I tell my kids, right, it's 9:30, school starts, I mean, you can imagine the kind of reaction they get from them. They're like, yeah, no, I don't think so. You sit on the World Happiness Council. I'm really interested to hear more about that and how you try and achieve global happiness.
Yeah, this is lovely. It's the United Arab Emirates who've been very innovative on this. Actually, 2 accounts. They have a Minister of Happiness, Uhud, who's fantastic, and then they also have actually a Minister of Artificial Intelligence. So it's pretty cutting edge stuff. It's easy to be cynical about this and say, oh, happiness, and you know, what is this Aristotelian, so on and so forth. But to be honest, isn't that kind of what we're all striving for? And we find different types of paths to get there. And for me, you know, in the big perspective, it's about 3 things. One is about family and friendship, you know, the types of relationships that you're able to establish throughout your life, and how deep they are and how meaningful and important they are. And I found, I've gone back to a lot of my childhood friends during the crisis as well, with WhatsApp groups and these kinds of things. So that's a little bit of a silver lining. The second one is the mind thing, and I firmly believe that you have to keep on re-educating yourself all the time. And the curious mind is the one that at the end of the day is the happy mind. I hate to say this, but the cynical mind rarely, is very happy. So if you sort of start with the Aristotelian approach that, know thyself, or know that you don't know, and then sort of allow yourself to be taught and learn new things every day, I think that's very fulfilling. And I found that now that I've left politics and have more time to read again, what that does to the brain. It does wonders. And the third thing, as I said, is the body part. And there you need three things, and this is important. You need 8 hours of sleep, right, Samantha? You need 1 hour of exercise, and then you need to eat healthy and good food. I think if you achieve those a few days out of the week, you'll be all right.
Definitely something to aim for. Alexander, thank you for answering my questions. We have had a few questions coming in. I'm just having a look. This is from Ben Strickland saying, good morning. Does Alexander see the pandemic as a cohesive agent for closer collaboration around the world, or as the Missouri state claim against the Chinese government might indicate, does he see a more fractured, less collaborative world post-pandemic?
Okay, thanks for the good question. And my simple answer is, I think in terms of cooperation and globalization, it'll be first 1 step back, but then 2 steps forward. And this is a very natural reaction. We basically go native in these types of situations. We want to protect our own. I mean, it's a little bit like you personally. You're probably worried about, am I going to get sick? Am I going to catch the virus? Then you look at your family. Is a family going to catch the virus? Then you look at friends. And our initial reaction in the beginning is we're getting a bit wary. We don't touch other people. We go and get groceries wearing masks and gloves and so on and so forth. And I think states and global cooperation is the same. Secondly, I think a lot of the global leaders at the moment, what they want to do is claim victory for their own. And when you do that, you quite often reject the other. So that's why you hear the Missouri type of language coming and trying to find blames. And the third thing is that I think this is going to go in a cycle. So first, you don't believe that it's happening. When it's happening, you don't believe that it pertains to you. When it pertains to you, you try to manage it. And after you've managed it, you start looking at other people to blame. And we're very much at that stage here in Finland right now. There's daily some kind of a new scandal coming from who got the subsidies where, why didn't the government do that, what minister knew which thing, what are the health authorities doing, and this is going to go on for a little while. But once all the dust settles, I think at the end of the day, we're going to have a lot of leaders around the world coming and say, hey, let's not let this happen again. We need some kind of a covenant, some kind of an agreement, how we deal with this in the future. We don't hide information from each other, how we help each other in difficult situations. So 1 step back, 2 steps forward.
And Saurabh Agarwal has sent this question in. Welcome to you. Saying, sir, Oman's GDP is all about oil. It is junk rated, huge population and a closed economy. No more will GCC countries. Oh, just lost that end of that question there. Hang on, it just popped up. I'll try and get back to it.
Let me see if I find it here.
Disappeared from my screen.
Sorry, it's actually if you go to answers, you'll find it down right at the bottom if you scroll. Sorry, I went a bit early.
Answered. Oh, here we go. Thank you. No more will GCC countries save each other. Will it be social, economic, and political? What will the social, economic, and political fallout be?
I've been to Oman. It's a lovely place, but I would not dare to give you an in-depth analysis about the GCC countries and the outcomes. Having said that, if you look at some of the countries in the area, Oman, for instance, the United Arab Emirates, they've been tremendous success stories, basically from rags to riches since the 1970s. And of course, as we well know, a lot of it has been raw material based and oil. And I think a lot of the social stability that we see in these countries is based on this sort of benign type of thinking and leadership, not on traditional democratic regimes. And it'll be interesting to see what happens. I would assume that Oman, and having dealt with a few authorities there over the years, is well prepared for these types of crises, that the welfare system is well put. Whether there'll be solidarity between the Gulf countries in these types of situations, I'm not qualified to say that. I did see in the beginning in Europe that there was very little solidarity, but now suddenly I think solidarity is all the talk in town. So I do wish you good luck, and I must say that I was one of those people in front of the screen a couple of days ago when the oil prices in the US trading went to minus $40. I assume there is a market logic to it, clearly. And now it's going to be a lot about supply and demand and try to salvage the situation for the oil producing countries.
Well, there's a follow-up question picking up on that point from one attendee saying, what impact do you think this will have on oil price and demand, supply change, affect the industry and economies?
Oh, you guys are putting me in a tough spot here. To be honest, I think it's too early to say, and I certainly would not be able to give you a clear analysis. I can only look at my neighboring country, which is Russia. We have 1,300 kilometers of border with them. And usually the break-even point for Russia is between $30 to $40 per barrel. And approximately 50% of budget income or state income used for the budget in Russia comes from oil and gas exports. And I would assume that in the Kremlin at this particular moment, there is a certain sense, if not of panic, at least of reflection of what are we going to do. I think this is a good reminder for all the oil producing countries that oil is not going to be eternal in terms of a source of energy. And especially when we are fighting climate change, you're going to have to start looking for other renewable and alternative energy sources.
So Noel Clahane has sent in this question. Morning to you, Noel. Will the EU pay any price for its hesitant initial response to the crisis and for export and freedom of movement restrictions, as well as a perceived lack of solidarity with Italy and Spain?
I think it definitely will, and it did take a hit right in the beginning. I must add, though, that remember, this is a little bit of a tug of war, information war as well. I mean, I found it quite mind-boggling that in Italy, the country to which I'm going to move soon, the Chinese national anthem was played on the balconies early on in the crisis. And this, I think, showed in a miserable way that the European states had failed in at least communicating their solidarity. Because remember that if you look at European solidarity at the moment, it has 5 pillars. Number 1 is the European Central Bank. Number 2 is the European Investment Bank, which is basically saving with its financial instruments small and medium-sized businesses. Number 3 is the Economic Stability Mechanism, ESM. Number 4 is the Commission's package on employment. And number 5 is what they're discussing now, a recovery fund or Corona bonds or whatever you want to call them. So there's no shortage of money being put into the system, but because the language was so difficult. And I do think as well that my good friend and colleague, Hoekstra, the finance minister of the Netherlands, made a bit of a communications blunder early on in the crisis when he was basically pointing the finger in a rather cold fashion towards Spain. So I think there's going to be a lot of repairing of trust and feeling, and Europe will take a hit in terms of popularity and solidarity, both of them, I think, going down. But I do hope that we recover from this as well.
Okay, and we've had this question from an anonymous attendee saying, you mentioned innovation after these periods of big changes as we're going through. Finland's government mentioned a little while ago an option to try a 4-day week rather than the European standard of 5 days a week. Would the 4-day week be a great compromise to a new and better work-life balance and more time to also travel, consume, which in a way would help the economy? And if there are not enough workforce bandwidth for the companies, it would be a good way to employ more people and reduce the global level of unemployment.
First of all, I have to disappoint you that that was actually fake news. And you see how fast news travels. It was something that our now Prime Minister had said a year 2 years back in a seminar saying that we could actually reflect. But then when one thing leads to another, suddenly it becomes big news that Finland is going for a 4-day work week. No, we're not. Because I think the productivity levels are not strong enough to be able to do that. What we did do when I was finance minister was to have a pilot on basic income. And unfortunately, the sort of sample was a bit too small, about 2,500 people. And we gave them 500 euros sort of as a one-off payment for X amount of months, and said, whatever you earn on top of that, that's absolutely fine. You're not going to for some people it worked, for others it didn't. I think probably the future work is going to be very different from what we think, and we are unfortunately still thinking about it in hours and in numbers. And I think this is an old-fashioned way of doing it. In other words, 4 working days or 5 working days. I mean, if you are in our line of work, which I assume a lot of the people are now sitting in front of their screens, we are much more flexible. I used to think that the best way in life was to have an 8 + 8 + 8. In other words, 8 hours of sleep, 8 hours of work, and 8 hours of play. But now I find myself with these modern gadgets that I'm basically, 24 hours online, including the weekends. Now, if you then in the healthcare sector, if you're working for a factory, then of course doing something really physical, then it might be a little bit different. I think it's all going to be linked to whether we can increase productivity. And unfortunately, there's very little evidence that the ongoing digital revolution, at least up until now, is increasing productivity. And we actually end up working more than we used to.
Okay, and last question from Sagar Faruhi. Sagar, hi, welcome to you. Who says prosperity is often defined in GDP terms, supported by economics of endless growth. How can governments use this pandemic to move our economies from a growth and shareholder value based one to one that sees production in true service of the well-being of humanity?
I think that question answers, and gives the answer itself. I do think that we need to start moving away from raw economic data, namely GDP per capita calculation, towards a broader estimate of well-being and welfare. And of course, it's easy for me to say because according to the UN, for the 3rd time running, Finland is the happiest country in the world. But you do need to find new types of indicators because, we've reached the stage in the world where we have basically the luxury of not having really to worry about where we get our food. I'm not saying this is all over the world, but in comparison to previous centuries, you cannot say that there is famine by definition. So we've gone into a phase where we can think about various ways of measuring happiness. For me, it's got a lot to do with the environment, with the climate, with the air, with opportunity, with security and safety nets, with fulfilling yourself. And I do think that at the end of the day, we have to go more towards looking at what the individuals want in life. And I hope we can reach that stage sooner rather than later. So, I like all of those countries which have a happiness GDP index. Bhutan, for instance, I welcome that type of thinking. And I think that's the line of thinking we should have in the future as well. Not at all underplaying the importance of raw economic data.
Alexander, that's a lovely point on where to leave it. We all need more happiness, don't we? We should all measure our happiness as well. I think appreciate what we do have. And thank you very much for being with us for that fascinating insight into all the areas that we covered there about the fallout from COVID-19 and hopefully some positives as well to take away from that. Thank you to everybody who joined the webinar today from all over the world, from Belgium, from France. We've had people from Indonesia, from India. Really great to have you with us. And thank you very much for being here and lovely to see you all.
Likewise, thanks very much on behalf of all of us at London Speaker Bureau, and have a good end of the week. Thanks a lot.